Macho guapo. Hello, everyone. I want to tell you a story. Once upon a time, at a hospital not that far from here, I was sitting with my grandmother at the end of her life. And it was one of those moments when we could sit down together. It was just me and her, and we were away from the stresses of family, and we could talk about all the things that we couldn't talk about in the rest of our lives. And at the end of that time that I had with her, she reminded me, never forget who you are. My grandmother never forgot who she was. She was Nanai, or Siberian native. And her family was displaced by communism from her homeland. And my grandfather's family was entirely killed by communists during the Cultural Revolution. So it was a traumatic time for them. It was a very traumatic time for them. And I found myself thinking about my grandmother, and one of the things that she had to do in order to survive, like indigenous peoples everywhere, was she had to hide her indigenous identity. But at home, she never forgot, and she'd regale me and my brother with these stories, the stories of our culture, the stories of fish bigger than boats, and our heroes riding on the backs of orcas. So as an adult, I wanted to chase down those stories and find them in my life. And so I started looking around, and that's how I ended up in Arctic Alaska, which is the closest I could come to my own homeland. In case you haven't heard, America and Russia don't get along very well right now. So I found myself in the homeland of the Alaskan Inupiaq. The Inupiaq are whale hunters, and they've been whale hunters for a very long time. Working on this multi-year project for 4 years, I came to understand that the bowhead whale, hunting whales for two millennia, means that the whale is at the very core and center of what it means to be indigenous, what it means to be Inupiaq. And this is the story that was in the 2018 issue of National Geographic. All right, I want to take you on a journey to the northernmost point of Alaska. And even a little bit further to the sea ice floating on the Arctic Ocean. So the Inupiaq have an unbroken tradition of hunting whales from the sea ice. And this is done by umiak, or skin boat. So because the Arctic, this portion of the Arctic doesn't have very many resources, they are framed by wood and covered in the skins of seals. So in order for it to happen, though, we live on the sea ice during this time in the spring. And the sea ice is a beautiful place. It's a mythical place. It's hard not to find and see stories of all the things that sort of creation stories that indigenous peoples have in this place. It's almost like everywhere you look, there's something magical happening. But ultimately, what we're doing when we sit on the ice whaling is we're waiting for the bowhead whale to come by and give itself. A whaling crew is composed of both men and women, and in Inupiaq society, it's the highest status that you can have is to be a whaler. And the whaling captains and the whaling captains' wives are definitely all the leaders in contemporary Inupiaq society. What's funny is that in Inupiaq, whaling captain is umielek, and whaling captain's wife is immune. But only in English is it referential. So for Inupiaq, those two words are completely different and they don't refer to each other. But because it's very important for Inupiaq, in terms of status, young people get on board right away. Most whalers start when they're 6 years old, when they're very young. And we need them. Aside from the fact that they're often out there fetching coffee for the captain, we also need them for their physical strength. All the greenhorns have to do things like break ice. I also happen to be a greenhorn, so I am also breaking ice out there. And we have to literally break mountains down to molehills. So we're taking these 30-foot high pressure ridges in the ice and breaking them down until they're flat so that our umiak can travel across quickly in the event of an emergency. And the sea ice stretches from the shore to the sea, which may be miles, maybe 15 miles out. Sometimes this takes months. But the actual act of whaling is a quiet one. Most of whaling, the majority of the time that we spend whaling, we spend sitting on the ice, watching and waiting. 8 grown people will stand next to each other for hours at a time and not say a word. We're getting in the zone, we're listening to the sounds of the eiders, listening to the sound of the water, and being very much in tune with everything that's going on. And on some of those days, the beluga whales might come by, hundreds of them at one time, migrating through in the spring as they always do. We always say hello to them. On even quieter days, some of my Inuk friends might take an oar from the umiak and stick one end in the water and the other end up to their ear and listen. And the first thing you hear is the sound of the bearded seals, which are high and fluting and playful. And then also, sometimes when the bowhead whales come closer, you can hear their deep rhythmic sound, which is heavy and slow and very repeatable. But living on the sea ice isn't all just this sort of fairy tale land where everything is beautiful and easy and magical. It's also the Arctic, and it's real. And in the springtime, the ice fog likes to set in because we are coastal. So the ice fog comes in the night and then leaves everything with a ½ inch of hoarfrost. And even though the nighttime might only be 25 degrees Fahrenheit, it's very cold. It's much colder than you would think. The other thing about our sea ice camp is that the tent that we use is sized for only half the crew. So only half the crew can ever sleep at one time. The biggest part of this is to ensure that we always have people on watch, because the ice is a very dangerous place. Living on the ice means that we have to watch out for the number one thing, which is other ice. We want to avoid an ivu. An ivu is when the pack ice comes in from the outside and runs into the ice that we're standing on, buckling it inwards for miles. And everything that's standing on that ice goes down into the Arctic Ocean. So generally best avoided. And when we want to do that, we have to evacuate off the ice in a hurry. We often have less than 15 minutes to get from the time that we notice to the time that we get everything packed and away. Of course, the other big danger on the ice are the nanut, or the polar bears, which come in different flavors. Some of those flavors are adorable. Some of those other flavors are survivors. But nanuk are a big problem for us as well. Inupiaq really welcome them, and so during the whale butchering season, lots of polar bears like to come around and they will circle. And Inupiaq particularly like the big old ones, and they say, let him eat, let him eat. And so we make sure that there is whale maktak and blubber around for them to come eat. But unfortunately, polar bears aren't on this same script. They prefer meat on the hoof, as it were, and so we always keep the children to the center and guards to the outside during this time. I've seen as many as 13 wandering around us at one time. But sometimes conflicts happen, and they're unavoidable. And I'm reminded, as I hear from older Inupiaq and from elders, that the number of conflicts that keeps happening is increasing as the bears get a little bit more desperate. But Inupiaq are storytellers. Like indigenous peoples everywhere, storytelling is a big part of it. There's the traditional hunting stories, of course, where we're passing on information from one generation to the next. But then another big part of it is in the modern day, we have a new system of storytelling called the Vhf Radio. And the VHF is this like supercomputer. It's this black box where all of this information goes in, and the hunters are always talking to each other. So the whalers are always inputting information. And then every once in a while, someone asks something, a really difficult question. It's usually a journalist. And then a question will mill about in there, sometimes for weeks. And then one day, an answer comes out. And it's not a question that any single person can answer. The VHF is also really useful for sons and mothers to stay in touch, for daughters and fathers to stay in touch, so it's the big family communion as well. I like to say that the sea ice is a place where it's long periods of waiting, punctuated by moments of sheer adrenaline, and indeed, there comes a time when the actual harpoon is thrown, when the whale chooses to give itself. Everywhere you go among Inupiaq whalers, they'll all tell you the same thing: the whale has chosen us. And often I've seen whales go by where the captain says, that one's not for us. Just watch and wait. The right one will find us and give itself. For Inupiaq, and indeed for indigenous peoples, generally speaking, this idea of something from the land giving itself to you is not a metaphor. Westerners like to think of it as a metaphor, but it's not really. It's this kind of spirituality that we have is not the kind of spirituality that we think of with ceremony and drums, but it's a deeply quiet spiritual thing that we all hold inside of ourselves. Whaling is a community-based effort. It takes a village to bring up a whale, and this is a big part of what makes the Inupiaq who they are, because no one person can haul a whale up onto the ice. This particular one, 48 tons, took 50 people 8 hours to bring up, and in the process, the ice broke under several times because this is a thin plate, and increasingly it becomes very difficult to bring up the whales because there's not a single piece of multi-year ice left in order for the whales to be brought up onto. But the whole village benefits, and every single person in the village will get a piece of the whale. It's not divided evenly, of course, and that there's a traditional time-honored system for dividing up the whale. But Inupiaq, like indigenous peoples everywhere, we are all quite modern. We live in modern places, but it's a little bit modified, right? So we live these subsistence lives in remote places, and as we do, we bring subsistence into our worlds. What might look like a Midwestern dinner table has, instead of, say, a piece of venison on it, or something else that you may be used to, we have a slab of muktuk, or a jar of fermented seal oil. And then in the summertime, we have subsistence hunting camps. But it's really clear and evident, right, that the lives that we lead are a cross between those that are ancient and the new things that we adopt, all the modern things that we adopt and we choose to bring into our lives. And in the summertime, it's the time to celebrate, say, Nulukatak, which is the whaling festival, when our successful whalers are thrown into the air maybe as high as 30 feet. And we quite literally depend on the hands of our neighbors and friends and family to catch us and let us down. And we throw them into the air to celebrate and say, thank you. Thank you for keeping us all alive. So I want to remind people one thing. To the east of Inupiaq territory in Alaska, to the west of Inupiaq territory in Alaska are all Inuit peoples. And the Inuit peoples who are not Inupiaq have some of the highest suicide rates in the world. One of the biggest reasons for that is because they have a broken tradition of whaling, because that subsistence right was taken away from them. And the Inupiaq were lucky enough and had elders far-seeing enough to say, oh, actually, this is really important to us. We should keep it going. And they fought for the rights to continue to whale, and they did. All right. Oh, sorry. So I want to say one thing. The world is full of stories. But how many of those stories don't just tell us what we already know? How many of those stories teach us to see the world from a truly different perspective? It used to be easy to justify telling the stories of other people's communities from the dominant culture's point of view. After all, a story in National Geographic is going to reach millions of people. But what happens a year after that story runs, or 5 years after that story runs? When I'm working with marginalized communities, my ultimate duty is to the people in the communities that I photograph. Years ago, I met a young Yupik woman who said to me, I spent some time with her, and she confided in me, out of a lot of pain, I wish I was white. I wish I was white. And I had nothing to say to her. I was speechless. What can I say to this amount of pain that comes out in this way? One day, she's going to see her uncle or her grandmother in the pages of National Geographic, the way that she knows them, the way that she recognizes her people and her culture, not the way that indigenous people are stereotyped or thought of by the outside world. And on that day, she's going to be proud to be who she is. And that will make me proud to be who I am, because that's the same gift that my grandmother gave me a lifetime ago. Thank you.